Tonight we're not diving into the words of a philosopher or the conquests of a forgotten general. No, tonight we're plunging into something far more chaotic, messy, and real. How ancient people survived when the world around them quite literally fell apart. Think crumbling cities, rivers where there shouldn't be rivers, and diseases that made your neighbors drop like apples in a storm. You think your week was rough? Try surviving a volcanic eruption with nothing but a wooden spoon and a goat. From firestorms in wooden cities to floods that swallowed whole communities and plagues that turned temples into morgues, ancient disasters weren't just terrifying. They were defining moments of survival, ingenuity, and sometimes downright absurdity. So get comfortable, turn your lights low, grab a mug of something warm or weirdly medieval, and join me as we travel back to a world where resilience was the only real currency. Before we begin, hit that like button only if you find this kind of dive into the past as strangely fascinating as I do, and drop a comment telling me, where are you watching from and what time is it there? It's always surreal seeing our little community light up around the globe. Okay, let's begin. Imagine waking up in a city where the ground never stops murmuring beneath your feet. Not metaphorically, but actually trembling, like it's trying to tell you something. You're not in Tokyo or San Francisco. You're in an ancient stone city perched on a fault line, maybe somewhere in what we now call Anatolia or the dusty stretches of what used to be southern Italia. The year? Doesn't really matter. It's just the 11th season since the rains came late. Calendars were more poetic than practical. But what matters is what's about to happen. You're barefoot. It's warm. Someone's lighting the morning cook fire next door, and pigeons, or something like them, are arguing loudly on the rooftops. And then the earth moves. Not a polite nudge, not a subtle sway. It heaves like a beast shaking off flies. Roof tiles clatter down like pebbles. People scream in ways that suggest their gods aren't listening. And suddenly, what was once a quiet, waking city is chaos, wrapped in dust and falling masonry. In the ancient world, earthquakes were not just disasters. They were omens. They were gods warring beneath the soil or monsters imprisoned too long breaking free. Your local temple might be more concerned with who angered the spirits than how to reinforce the load-bearing walls. And yet, people survived. Somehow. Again and again. You might think ancient folks had no idea how to handle it, but that's the strange thing. They kind of did, after the dust settled. Sometimes literally hours later, because cleanup was not a priority when half the village was trying to find their uncle under a collapsed olive press. They rebuilt. Often better. They didn't have seismic sensors or early warning apps, but they had intuition. A few generations down, you'd find whole districts rebuilt farther from fault lines, with wider alleyways or domed structures instead of flat roofs, simply because someone noticed those held up better. It wasn't engineering in the modern sense, but it was survival through pattern. Take, for example, an anonymous family, let's call them the Yene tribe, living on a plateau that shook every third season. After their stone-walled granary collapsed twice in 15 years, they just stopped storing grain in the house. Instead, they hollowed out pits in the hillside and learned to seal them with clay and ash. Primitive? Maybe. Effective? Extremely. The community called the new method sleeping roots, because the grain slept in the earth until they needed it. Poetic and practical. But earthquakes weren't the only terrifying guest knocking on the doors of ancient lives. Fire, that glorious symbol of warmth and cooking and divine spark, was just as likely to devour everything you owned before breakfast. Think about it. Ancient cities were built like tinderboxes, not the app, the real kind. Wood, straw, fabrics, tightly packed homes with no real concept of fire safety regulations. One candle, one coal, one angry deity with a flair for the dramatic, and an entire neighborhood could be a pillar of smoke by noon. Let's rewind to an unnamed port city somewhere near the Eastern Sea. Traders pour in daily. Spice, wine, papyrus. The smells are intoxicating and so is the risk. A street performer lights a small torch to impress a crowd. It tips, lands in a pile of shipping netting. 2 minutes later, flames climb a thatched roof like it's a ladder to the gods. No alarms, no fire brigade, just chaos. A boy screams, Someone hurls a bucket of wine, which doesn't help, and within the hour, the quarter is ash. But again, people learn. They adapt. Within a generation, homes in that city start showing stone firewalls between structures. Some districts move their cooking areas into communal courtyards. One inventive weaver even coats her roof with a mixture of mud and goat dung that somehow resists catching fire. She's ridiculed for it until the next blaze passes her home like it's unappetizing. Then suddenly, she's a genius. That's how it worked. Innovation born from survival, adopted through gossip and necessity. And yet, perhaps the most insidious disaster of the ancient world wasn't the visible ones. It wasn't flame or quake or flood. It was what you couldn't see. Disease, the kind that didn't roar in like a lion but whispered through markets and temples, wearing the faces of your neighbors. Imagine a summer festival. Laughter, music, roasted game meats, and garlands of flowers. And somewhere in the crowd, a merchant who doesn't feel quite right. His cough is dry. His forehead is warm. By week's end, 5 stalls are empty. By month's end, the temple is shuttered not for prayer, but for burial. The worst part? No one really knew why. Ancient theories of disease were less germ-based and more vibe-based. Too much bad air, curses, eating the wrong kind of fish. People tried to fix things in all the wrong ways. Burning incense until everyone choked, sacrificing animals or abandoning entire towns. Some went full panic mode, locking themselves in their homes with jars of honey and hopeful songs. Others doubled down on ritual, praying harder, fasting longer, believing the gods would notice their suffering and hit the divine undo button. But buried under the superstition were hints of truth. In a small desert outpost, a midwife, let's name her Kea, starts noticing that women who boil their birthing tools in hot water seem to recover faster. She doesn't understand microbes, but she understands patterns. She starts insisting on this boiling thing. People roll their eyes. Then they notice. Fewer fevers, more mothers survive. Her silly habit spreads, and suddenly cleanliness becomes ritual. A survival pattern dressed up as sacred tradition. Again and again, ancient communities faced what seemed like extinction-level events. And again they adapted. They remembered. Not always in writing, not in scrolls or official proclamations. Often in songs, in habits, in the way a child is told not to touch a well after sunset, because that's when the spirits are restless, or more likely, when the rats come to drink. Wisdom cloaked in story, and as for floods, the ancient world had more than its fair share of them. Rivers weren't tamed by concrete and maps. They were gods in their own right, moody and unforgiving. One year they gave life. The next, they took it. Entire regions learned to build homes on stilts, or weave floating baskets to carry grain. The Nile was both the bringer of abundance and the harbinger of death. Farmers danced when it flooded just right, but when it overshot, they mourned and rebuilt. In a mountainous village, heavy rains would turn footpaths into rivers. So what did they do? They studied the flow. They shaped their paths with stones so water would channel away from homes. They planted reeds in key places to act as barriers. No degrees in hydrology, just the fierce will to outlive the storm. That's the heartbeat of the ancient world in crisis. Not helplessness, but a brutal, beautiful ingenuity. They didn't always understand what they were up against, but they understood that life was not a gift. It was a negotiation. One you had to constantly win, not with power, but with observation, with community, with stubbornness. So the next time your power goes out or your phone glitches during a rainstorm, remember this. There were people who survived fire with buckets, plagues with boiled water, earthquakes with prayer and clever architecture. They built lives in the jaws of chaos and called it home. When the fields dried out and the winds turned hot, not with the pleasant caress of summer but with the parched breath of drought, ancient people didn't gather in marketplaces to argue over politics. They gathered in silence to watch the horizon, hoping the clouds were more than mirages. You see, starvation wasn't just a word. It was a slow ghost that came into homes uninvited, whispering in cracked granaries, counting the days since the last real harvest, making deals with desperation. There are no loud beginnings to a famine. It's not a war. It's not a storm. It sneaks in slowly. First the bread gets thinner, then the stew grows more watery, then the animals vanish from their pens. Sold, stolen, eaten. You hear fewer footsteps in the streets, fewer songs in the evenings. Hunger is a silencer, and when you live in a world with no refrigeration, no global trade to ship grain from richer lands, no stockpiles managed by a Federal Reserve, you realize survival hinges not on wealth, but on creativity and grit. In a fishing village wedged between jagged cliffs and a moody sea, there lived people whose entire diet depended on what the tide brought in. One season, the fish stopped coming. No reason. Maybe the currents changed. Maybe the gods were playing dice. But the boats came back empty day after day. The nets dried under the sun like decorative sadness. And yet, the village didn't vanish. Instead, they turned inward. Someone remembered that the cliffs grew moss that goats loved. Someone else recalled how to make flatbread using a mash of dried seaweed and ground acorns. It tasted like wet bark. But it kept children breathing. They even traded it with a caravan that passed through once a month, swapping their salty green bread for barley that had turned bitter in the heat. Somehow, both parties walked away thinking they got the better deal. That's hunger logic. That's survival. Further inland, along the windy ridges where shepherds carved homes into stone and named their goats like family, there were winters that lasted too long. Grain stores ran low. The snow didn't melt until the third moon cycle, and by then, livestock had either frozen or been consumed. In one such year, a healer, not a doctor in the modern sense, more like a mix between a herbalist and storyteller, discovered that boiling the bark of the elder tree in water removed its bitterness and made a broth that was oddly filling. Not nutritious in any obvious sense, but enough to keep bones from clattering inside bodies. He handed the bark broth to elders first, saying it would make their dreams more vivid. It didn't, but it kept them alive until the ice retreated. That spring, people dug into the thawing soil like treasure hunters, burying their faces in the smell of damp earth like it was perfume. And when the first tuber sprouted, the village danced, not from joy, but from pure, exhausted relief. And then there were the cities. Yes, the big, proud, marble-draped places where people in linen robes discussed philosophy under painted ceilings. But even cities aren't safe from hunger. Because when the rural farmlands fail, when the rivers shift course or the sun bakes the wheat into straw, cities suffer first in spirit and last in ration. Imagine a bustling plaza filled with vendors and laughter, slowly morphing into lines of thin faces waiting for bread that never arrives. In one such city, whose name is now dust on a stone tablet, the ruling council issued a decree. Anyone who could cultivate food within the city walls would be rewarded with copper rings, a rare and valuable currency. And so began a strange renaissance of rooftop gardens. People hauled soil up crumbling staircases, planted seeds in broken urns, repurposed aqueduct leaks into irrigation. Balconies bloomed with beans and cabbage. It didn't solve everything. It couldn't, but it showed a truth we often forget. Hunger sharpens the mind, not just the ribs. One of the most haunting stories comes from a traveling scribe, whose records we only know from fragments translated across languages and centuries. He wandered into a town in the hills where famine had stretched for 3 seasons. The people there had adopted a curious ritual. Every evening, the entire town would sit around the main square. No food, no feast, just silence. Then, one by one, the elders would tell stories of the best meals they had ever eaten: roasted hare with honey glaze, lentil soup with crushed garlic, even something called sky eggs, which no one could quite explain. The children would listen, mouths closed, eyes wide, and then everyone would go to sleep. No complaints, no crying, just dreams flavored with memory. The scribe called it the fasting theater. He said the town had the lowest mortality rate he'd seen in the region. Maybe it was the sense of hope. Maybe it was the way stories fed something deeper than the stomach. Either way, they survived. Then there were the desperate ones. the places where food didn't just vanish, it became forbidden. One nomadic clan in the grasslands faced a drought so severe that even the insects fled. They made a vow: no hunting, no foraging, not until the spirits gave a sign. Days passed, then weeks. Finally, a young boy returned from the edge of the horizon carrying a single cactus in bloom, a flower in a place where nothing should have grown. They took it as a sign. They began harvesting again, carefully, reverently. Whether divine intervention or coincidence, the rains returned soon after. The story passed down for generations, not about the drought, but about the flower, a symbol of waiting, of patience, of faith in something unseen. Across oceans, in lands where maize ruled and hills were stepped like massive green ladders, food crises were answered with rituals and architecture. Entire villages shifted schedules to accommodate planting moons, building stone channels that pulled water from miles away into dry terraces. Children were taught to sing to the seeds, not because the crops could hear, but because planting should never be silent. It reminded them that food was not owed, it was earned. That even in hunger, ceremony mattered. That the act of hoping for harvest was itself an act of resistance. And let's not forget the people who fled. When the land turned cruel, many didn't stay to fight it. They packed what they could carry, often just dried roots and a single animal, and walked. Miles, weeks, across deserts, through snow, toward a place where someone had heard a cousin say there was still food. Migration wasn't an escape, it was a gamble. Some died on the road, others found refuge, and some, after finding their new homes, built shrines to the lands they left behind. Not out of anger, but gratitude for the lessons of hunger, for the push it gave them to move forward. So you see, ancient hunger wasn't just about the stomach. It was about innovation disguised as tradition, about boiling bark, singing to seeds, carving canals by hand, about feeding the spirit when the plate was empty. Starvation stripped away pretense, left only the raw parts of humanity. And in those moments, our ancestors chose not just to survive, but to adapt, to remember, and sometimes even to dance. The wind didn't just blow in the ancient world, it roared like something with lungs. When storms came, they weren't soft distractions or mild inconveniences. They were battles. Long, drawn-out, skyborne wars that pitted raw nature against mud-brick homes and timber walls. The kind of storms that darkened the horizon like spilled ink and sent birds flying in circles. Imagine waking to the sound of something scraping across the sky. Not thunder, but something worse. The sound of branches bending until they break, of tiles snapping off rooftops, of shutters flapping like panicked wings. In a time before radar, before warning systems, before any reliable method of predicting when or how the skies would open, people relied on something else entirely: instinct, superstition, and inherited memory. When the air went too quiet, when the dogs refused to bark, when your grandmother stood in the doorway and said, "It's coming," you believed her, because she remembered. And because the last time no one listened, the east wall of the village ended up in the river. There was no such thing as a safe coast in the ancient world. You didn't build near the water without understanding its moods. Shorelines were seen as gifts and threats at once, providers of fish and salt and trade, but also cursed zones where the sea could crawl inland like a beast in the night. Coastal communities, especially those tucked into coves or hugging cliffs, told stories of great waves not as myth, but as memory. One such tale survives in the oral tradition of a fishing people we now know only through fragments. Their elders spoke of the Gray Hand, a storm so fierce it lifted ships from the harbor and dropped them onto rooftops 3 streets inland. That wasn't metaphor. That was experience carved into the culture. After that storm, perhaps in the 5th or 6th generation before their final migration, they began anchoring boats with triple stones, reinforcing their docks with a mixture of seagrass and clay, and planting high-visibility poles along the coast. Not to stop the storm, no one thought they could do that, but to watch it better, to see it coming. In a dry, mountainous land further south, storms meant something different. There, rain was both a miracle and a terror. When it arrived, it didn't fall politely. It attacked. The sky would open like a wound and pour down so hard it bruised the soil. And because the land was so parched most of the year, it couldn't absorb water quickly. Flash floods became legendary. Children were taught not to walk near dry riverbeds even under clear skies. Why? Because the water could come from miles away, rushing in like a stampede, carrying debris, livestock, even entire carts. There's a tale of a boy who wandered too far from the cliffs during an unexpected downpour. When the villagers found him hours later, he was sitting unharmed on top of a massive log, carried nearly 3 leagues by the current. He had no idea what happened. The river came, he said, and that was enough. Communities adapted in their own strange, brilliant ways. One highland tribe, often battered by hail and gale-force winds, developed a roofing technique involving overlapping layers of bark, mud, and woven reeds. It looked odd, almost like a shaggy animal crouching over their homes, but it worked. The shape reduced wind resistance. The weight kept the structure grounded, and the materials, oddly enough, absorbed sound. So when the storms came and screamed like banshees through the mountains, the homes beneath these strange rooftops stayed silent, warm, almost defiant. They called them skyskins. Each one was considered a small rebellion against the chaos above. In the flatter plains, where shelter was harder to come by and the storms had room to build speed, people turned to the ground itself. Whole settlements were designed half underground, sunken courtyards, low entrances, earthen berms that deflected wind. They didn't build up, they built down. One such village, uncovered recently beneath layers of sediment and dust, revealed an intricate network of tunnels connecting homes. During a storm, you didn't flee. You simply moved inward, one room deeper, then another, until the howl of the world outside was reduced to a whisper and a rattle. These weren't bunkers. They were homes. But homes with memory, with scars built into their very blueprints. Ships, of course, bore the worst of it. Ancient seafarers weren't reckless. They were bold. There's a difference. Before setting out, they consulted the winds not through instruments, but through observation, prayer, and sometimes animal behavior. Cats acting strange? Stay ashore. Smoke rising sideways? Don't untie the moorings. A certain type of cloud pattern over the northern horizon? Wait one more day. But still, ships were lost. Dozens. Hundreds. Storms that brewed in the open sea would catch merchant vessels mid-route and dash them against reefs like toys. But not every ship vanished. Some captains learned to read the sea's mood with terrifying precision. There's record of one man known only by a title, the Watcher, who could feel a change in pressure in his bones. When he ordered sails down, people obeyed without question. He once sailed through a 4-day storm with no mast, steering his ship using only oars and hope. His name, forgotten. His method, still debated. His story, survived in salt-stained ballads sung by harbor boys for centuries. And yet, not every storm came from the sea or sky. Some were made of sand. Entire civilizations on the edges of deserts faced tempests that blotted out the sun and scoured flesh from bone. Sandstorms weren't just dramatic events. They were reshaping forces. They buried roads, shifted borders, swallowed entire shrines. Travelers who didn't know better died with their eyes open, lungs full of dust, standing just steps from shelter they couldn't see. In one ancient market town, name long lost to time, the people developed an eerie method of protection: sound. When a storm was sensed, and the elders could feel it in the stillness, they would send runners through the town, banging gongs and howling like wolves. Not to scare people, but to guide them. The echo helped those trapped outside find their way through the blinding grit, a living GPS made of voices and brass. After every storm, there was ritual, not to summon the rain or banish the wind, though that was often the official purpose, but to process the trauma, to stand together, sing, rebuild, and remember. One coastal community had a song they only sang after a particularly brutal tempest. It didn't ask for mercy. It thanked the sea for sparing them even if it hadn't. You left the door open. It went, but did not take the hearth. That line survived longer than the language it was first sung in. And that's the thing. Memory, in the ancient world, was survival. If your grandmother remembered the direction in which the winds broke trees, you passed that on. If your uncle had a trick for tying ropes that wouldn't snap in hurricane gales, you tied that knowledge into every knot you taught your children. Weather for the ancients was not a backdrop. It was a character, a volatile, moody, divine being that couldn't be reasoned with, only studied, respected, and, in moments of quiet clarity, perhaps even understood. Their survival wasn't luck. It was observation turned into architecture, prayer turned into planning, superstition shaped into systems. They didn't wait for rescue. They built resilience. So the next time a storm rolls through your city and knocks out the power for a night, think of them. Think of the families huddled under bark roof homes in the mountains, or those navigating tunnels dug into plains, or the boat captain steering blind under starless skies. Think of the songs sung afterward, the lessons whispered before sleep, the knowledge passed not in textbooks, but through scars and stories. And understand, they didn't survive because they were stronger than nature. They survived because they listened to it. In a world where fire could erase a city faster than time itself, knowledge wasn't stored in clouds or copied into backups. It lived in fragile forms: wax tablets, brittle scrolls, clay tablets that cracked if you looked at them wrong, stories passed from one mouth to another like precious cargo. And so when catastrophe struck, whether it arrived as flame, flood, famine, or sword, it didn't just threaten lives or homes. It threatened memory. Culture, the fragile spine of human understanding built across generations, could vanish in the smoke of one torch, or drown in a single unseasonal rain. And yet, astonishingly, so much survived, not by accident, not because the ancients were lucky, but because they were relentless in remembering. They made memory mobile, gave it feet, cloaked it in song and riddle and rhythm, and carried it like fire inside them when everything else had turned to ash. Consider the scribes, not the image we often conjure of a man hunched over parchment in a marble hall, but rather a woman in a mountain temple with ink made from burned pine soot and a brush cut from reeds, or a blind elder who couldn't write, but could recite 15 generations of ancestry without faltering once. These were the keepers of memory. And when disaster came, and it always did, eventually, these were the people others turned to, not just for comfort, but for restoration. What did we used to grow here? They'd ask. What festival comes after the long rain? What do we chant when the sickness returns? These weren't quaint customs. They were tools. They were infrastructure. And when the written word failed, when texts were burned by invaders or buried under stone, it was these human libraries who resurrected meaning, who rebuilt worlds with syllables alone. Let's look at a ruined city. A once glorious capital surrounded by rivers that had turned to cracked mud. Walls scorched, statues broken, marketplaces empty but for bones and scorched wood. And yet, in the quiet ruins, a child sits beside her grandmother as the sun sets and listens. The old woman doesn't have scrolls, but she has stories. She speaks of the time when the rivers were tame, when 3 fish could be caught before sunrise, and the baker's bells sang at dawn. She sings the song of the moon cycle, not for entertainment, but because it tells when to plant certain seeds. The girl learns it, hums it. Later, when others gather, she hums it louder. Someone remembers the tune, another remembers the gesture. Together, they recreate something ancient. And from that fragile reconstruction, they know when to sow again, when to pray, when to wait. That is how civilizations survive collapse, not in towers of stone, but in memories seated in silence. Now imagine a kingdom where scholars once walked in long robes through shaded gardens, debating the nature of stars and soil and spirit. One morning, invaders arrive, not with arguments, but with torches. The royal library, known across the lands for its thousands of volumes, is set alight. Shelves fall. Flames dance like wicked laughter across shelves of philosophy and medicine. But before the fire consumes everything, a handful of servants, unnoticed, unarmed, slip into the chaos and take what they can carry. Not gold, not jewelry, but texts. Rolled up leaves of ink, formulas etched into thin copper sheets, and, most importantly, their own memories of what they once copied. When they flee to the mountains, they do so with more than books. They carry fragments of astronomy, healing recipes, translations of languages now lost to time, and in caves above a roaring valley they whisper these pages back into existence, one copy at a time, one night at a time. Because when knowledge is sacred, it doesn't die quietly. It howls and returns through those who believe it must survive. Elsewhere, in desert towns where ink was more rare than wine and papyrus more valuable than silver, people preserved knowledge differently. Through architecture, through alignment. One ruined temple, seemingly simple in its design, is built in such a way that at the summer solstice, light shines through a narrow slit and lands directly on a carved symbol, a spiral encircled by 7 dots. What does it mean? We still argue. But to the people who built it, it wasn't just art. It was timekeeping. It was a calendar. A reminder that even if the priest vanished or the scriptures faded, the sun would still return, the pattern would still speak. You didn't need to know letters to know when the rains were due. You needed to watch the light, count the days, remember the rhythm. That's how disaster-proof memory looked in the ancient world. It wasn't delicate. It wasn't always pretty. It was embedded in song, encoded in architecture, hidden in embroidery patterns and harvest rituals. One coastal society used a system of knots tied into strands of colored rope to record trade values, births, deaths, and lunar movements. When asked what the colors meant, they wouldn't say. Not out of secrecy, but because they didn't need to say. The meaning was known through touch, through tradition, through an invisible chain of learning that stretched back beyond names. You couldn't burn that. You couldn't steal it. It was in the hands of the weavers, the knot counters, the children taught from the moment they could speak to, "Watch how I do this," and listen to the rhythm. The greatest trick the ancient world pulled off wasn't inventing things. It was reinventing them after they were lost. Because everything was lost, again and again. Earthquakes, conquests, storms, pestilence, dynasties rising and crumbling like waves on the shore. But people held on. They rebuilt math from scratches on walls. They reimagined music from broken flutes and half-remembered lullabies. They reseeded language from shared dreams and mutual need. Nothing stayed gone forever, because someone always remembered enough to restart the fire. That was the philosophy of survival. Not preserving perfectly, but preserving enough. In one windswept plateau where winter could last for half the year, people once carved entire epics onto the sides of boulders. Not because they thought it was beautiful, but because they were tired of the old words being forgotten when fires took the books. The carvings weren't for the present. They were for the next collapse, the next rebuilding. And when the empire fell and the valleys turned empty, it was those boulders that whispered to wandering tribes, who touched the grooves with frozen fingers and learned the names of stars, the laws of land, the stories of gods they never knew. The stones outlived the thrones. So if you're wondering how ancient people made it through catastrophe after catastrophe without losing their soul, that's the answer. They didn't rely on permanence. They relied on people. People who carried knowledge in song and in scars, in melody and in muscle memory. They made remembering a communal act, a survival strategy, an emotional glue. And in doing so, they ensured that even when everything else burned, they themselves would become the books. When the dust settled and the fires dimmed after the water receded or the coughing stopped or the sky went quiet again, there was always a moment. A long, aching moment where people stood amidst the wreckage of what used to be, homes unrecognizable, markets silent, doorways leading to nothing, and they simply had to feel it. The weight of loss, the breathlessness of grief, the silent, unspoken understanding that something had ended. But what's most remarkable is not just that they endured these moments, it's how they turned them into rituals of healing. Because in the ancient world, survival wasn't just physical, it was emotional. You didn't just rebuild the walls. You had to rebuild the meaning of what stood inside them. There are records, oral and etched into crumbling stone, of villages that held funerals not just for people, but for objects. Broken plows, shattered statues, scorched trees. Not out of superstition, but respect. Because the loss of a harvest wasn't just economic, it was personal. That tree fed your family. That bowl belonged to your mother. That loom helped clothe your children. When it was destroyed, it took a piece of you with it. And so people mourned. They lit small lamps and placed them near ruined altars. They wove wreaths from the brittle grass that survived. They didn't rush to forget. They remembered, and in that act of memory began the slow process of rebuilding from the inside out. In one particularly poetic tradition found in an arid riverland, when a family lost someone to a flood or storm, they would paint a stone white and leave it near the water's edge, whispering the name of the lost aloud. Not to call them back, but to let them go. The act wasn't grand, it wasn't loud, but it said, "You were here, you mattered, and I will not let the river erase that." These stones, worn smooth by time and tide, formed quiet, unmarked graveyards along forgotten banks. A testimony to grief made gentle, made sacred. And more than that, to the healing power of naming the loss. Even in bustling cities where written records and carved monuments told stories of kings and traders, there were quieter corners where real healing happened. Women would gather under awnings to sing songs of the dead, not dirges, but lullabies, because in many places death was seen not as an end but a sleep. A long pause in a song that would be resumed somewhere else. Men would carve symbols into walking staffs, not for magic, but memory. A line for every friend lost, every field ruined, every child buried too soon. They carried those staffs with them not as weapons but as witnesses, evidence that they had walked through sorrow and chosen to keep walking anyway. And then there was humor. Yes, humor. It might seem odd, even offensive, to think of laughter in the ruins, but ancient people were not made of stone. They wept, yes, but they also laughed. Laughed at absurdity, at bad luck, at the strange ways the world chose to collapse. One traveling storyteller, known only by the nickname Ashfoot, would arrive in towns weeks after disasters and perform improvised plays mocking the very events that had nearly destroyed them. He'd impersonate thunder gods with high-pitched voices, pretend to be the wind stealing laundry, or act out being a panicked rooster during a quake. People laughed until they cried. Some just cried, but both were allowed. Because laughter, in those fragile, raw moments, wasn't disrespect, and it was defiance. It was proof that despair hadn't won. Children especially were never left out of the recovery. In a hilltop culture that endured repeated droughts, adults would lead children to burned fields after the crisis and encourage them to draw pictures in the ash, flowers, animals, faces. It wasn't educational. It wasn't religious. It was therapeutic. A way of saying, this land is still yours. This story is still ours. Go ahead and create something on it. Those fields, once marked by ruin, became early canvases of hope. Some parents even preserved the drawings, mixing ash with sap to seal the images onto cave walls, turning loss into legacy with a handful of soot and faith. Temples too transformed after disasters, where once they had been places of power, of law and hierarchy. After collapse, they became shelters, not just from rain, but from grief. A sacred hall that once held golden idols might now echo with the sobs of a mother, or the quiet murmur of prayer shared between strangers. Priests who once chanted in formality would sing instead with warmth, sometimes forgetting the words but never the tone. Some spiritual leaders, shaken by the sheer force of loss, abandoned their posts and walked among their people instead, not as guides, but as companions. The divine was no longer unreachable. It sat beside them, in the dirt, holding hands, silent. There was a belief in one coastal island that after a great storm, the spirits of those lost clung to pieces of driftwood and washed ashore in the nights that followed. So villagers would walk the beach for days, collecting wood, whispering greetings, offering food to the sea as thanks. Did they really believe the souls returned? Maybe. Maybe not. But that ritual gave structure to their sorrow. It offered a reason to keep going to the shore, to hope. And that act alone was enough to keep despair from closing its jaws around the whole community. Grief was never rushed. In some desert cultures, families wore the same garment for 30 days after loss, not just in mourning, but in defiance. "I am still here," the clothes said. "I am still carrying the weight." Only after that time, and a final meal shared with neighbors, would the garment be burned or buried. And with it, the heaviest part of the pain, not forgotten, not erased. Just acknowledged, honored, set down like a burden too long carried. And in all this, what echoes loudest isn't the pain itself, but the way people chose to feel it, not alone, not hidden, but together. Mourning was a communal act. If a neighbor lost their child, the entire block skipped market day. If a farmer's field was swallowed by flood, 10 others brought seeds without being asked. When words failed, they sat together in silence, a powerful language of presence. The message was simple and ancient and profoundly human. You are not alone in this. And that's how they rebuilt, not just with bricks and beams, but with music, stories, painted stones, acts of quiet courage. The healing didn't come from time alone. It came from meaning, from choosing to see the pain, name it, carry it, and still find something worth singing about. That's resilience, not just surviving the storm, but remembering how to live after it. There's a story, whispered across generations in a highland culture with no written script, of a woman known only as the Last Bell. She was not a priestess, not a scholar, not even someone of noble blood. She was a storyteller. Her job, if you could call it that, was to walk from village to village before the solstice festivals and retell the sacred tale of the twin rivers, the sky bird, and the birth of fire. But one year, the rains didn't come. Crops failed. The rivers ran dry. And then came the invaders, men on horseback, faces hidden behind iron, their torches leaving behind nothing but bone and smoke. The temples burned, the altars crumbled, and the priests, the official keepers of law, right, and record, disappeared into legend. But the Last Bell survived. She fled with nothing but a cracked pendant and her voice. And for years after the fall, when children were too young to remember the old city and too hungry to care, she told the stories anyway. Not in temples, in caves behind sheep pens, in the shadows of ruined granaries. She didn't just preserve memory, she passed it on. One rhyme, one ritual, one whispered myth at a time. And when she died, another woman took her place, and then another, until what should have been lost forever survived not in books but in people. This is not unique. Across the ancient world, when walls fell and the great structures crumbled, it was oral tradition, the embodied knowledge passed mouth to mouth, heart to heart, that preserved the core of cultures. No ink, no archive, just rhythm, cadence, breath. A fisherman in a port city might know the tide by watching birds and clouds. A mason might understand seismic shifts by the way a crack grows in a stone wall. None of this was academic. It was generational memory, tested, adapted, and protected through repetition. They told stories not just for entertainment, but because stories carried architecture, astronomy, medicine, ethics. In the ancient world, a fable was often a physics lesson wearing the costume of a moral parable. If the storyteller forgot a line, a generation might forget how to find water in the dry season. That's how fragile and powerful this form of memory truly was. When natural disasters hit, floods, quakes, droughts, the first to die were often the symbols, the statues, the scripts. But memory, tucked inside lullabies and riddles, survived. Take a remote farming culture that built their terraces on the side of a steep mountain range. They knew the rains could wash everything away, and they also knew that their children might not understand the importance of maintaining the stone walls unless those walls were named. So they named them. Each tier had a title, a song, a spirit associated with it. You didn't repair the wall just because it was a wall. You did it because it was the shoulder of the Earth Ox, or the arm of Sky Mother. And because of those names, the kids remembered. They passed it on. And the terraces stood, long after their creators had moved on or faded into the fog of time. But not all memory could be sung. Some had to be hidden. In war-torn provinces, scribes wrote knowledge into patterns. Textile weavers encoded herbal recipes into the weave of cloaks. A specific stitch meant a type of root. A particular knot meant how to prepare it. To outsiders, it was decoration. To those who knew, it was a medical guide. A traveling healer might wear an entire treatment protocol on his shoulder. In one drought-ravaged land, women braided stories into each other's hair. The number of twists, the position of the parting, the rhythm of the plaits, all told a tale of who had survived what, of where the safe wells were, of which path to take during migration. Hairstyles became maps. Embroidery became alphabets. Nothing was what it seemed, because everything was a storage device for meaning. There are examples of collapsed kingdoms where the only surviving fragments of their science were embedded in religious festivals. The precise timing of dance steps mirrored celestial movements. The order of musical notes reflected seed rotation cycles. People performed these rites because their ancestors told them to, but few realized they were reenacting an agricultural almanac, a manual for food security disguised as spiritual theater. Even in death rituals, memory was preserved. One river tribe, known for burying their dead under carved totems, inscribed not names but equations. The formulas for calculating safe travel days, tide changes, or salt drying schedules. These weren't tombstones. They were textbooks, monuments to applied wisdom. And when they could write, truly write, they didn't just document, they protected. Some communities carved their most sacred knowledge into stone, not for the glory of empire, but because stone outlasted fire. In an arid kingdom ruled by sand and wind, a council of engineers, though they wouldn't have called themselves that, designed a stone obelisk with grooves that only aligned with shadows twice a year. When the correct day arrived, the groove would point to a distant star. That star signaled the start of the planting season. If the city burned, if the rulers vanished, the stone would remain. No one needed to explain it. They just had to watch the light, learn the rhythm, understand that the universe too was a teacher, and stone the chalkboard. Even exile didn't stop the memory keepers. When entire populations were enslaved, scattered, or absorbed into rival empires, they took their knowledge with them, disguised it, carried it in proverbs, in food, in the way they raised their children. One displaced people group, forced to live in a mountain basin far from their original homeland, preserved their astronomical system by integrating it into the way they planted their gardens. Each bed was shaped according to a constellation. Each vegetable matched a star. As children tended the earth, they memorized the heavens. And even generations later, when they no longer remembered the name of their old capital, they could still trace Orion with their hands in the soil. This is how the ancient world truly endured. Not through monuments or kings, not through temples or taxes, but through mothers and uncles, weavers and midwives, teachers and stargazers, who looked at a crumbling world and said, "I remember," and then passed it on. Not once, but again and again, until what should have been lost became the foundation of something new. Because in the end, the only real library that survives the fire is the one you carry in your voice, in your hands, in your breath. It's easy to picture the ancient world as rigid, built on hierarchy carved in stone, kings above, priests beside them, merchants underneath, farmers at the base like roots, holding the weight of empire. But disasters don't respect thrones. Fire doesn't care about bloodlines. Floods don't pause for royal decrees. And when cities fell, and they did again and again, so did their systems. Entire lines of rulers vanished overnight, taken by disease, drowned by sea surge, or buried beneath temples that once stood as symbols of permanence. But what came after wasn't always anarchy. More often, it was reinvention. When the old ways cracked, something new crawled up through the fractures. Something smaller, scrappier, often fairer. When kings disappeared, communities remembered how to lead themselves. Picture a city once ruled by a dynasty, whose name was chiseled into every gate, a proud people, towering spires, laws written in gold leaf. Then the quakes came, 3 and 4 seasons. Not the end of the world, but the end of that one. Buildings fell, wells cracked, the palace roof buckled under the weight of its own pride. Survivors fled into the hills, into forests and stone clefts where no banners flew and no titles mattered. And there, huddled around shared fires and uncertain futures, they began again. No crown, no council, just need. Who can hunt? Who knows how to seal grain? Who remembers how to bind wounds? Authority became not a birthright, but a usefulness. The herbalist became more important than the treasurer. The well digger had more say than the astrologer. It wasn't rebellion, it was reality. These weren't primitive societies, they were resilient. In many ancient collapse zones, the absence of centralized power didn't lead to chaos, it led to local autonomy. Communities restructured around roles, not ranks. Decisions made in circles, not thrones. Elders chosen not because they were old, but because they had seen things, had survived things. In river valleys where floods wiped away capitals, trade guilds and farmers' circles emerged to coordinate repair and defense. When the capital couldn't send orders, the people sent for each other. They built levees with bare hands and burned wood for signals across hilltops. Leadership became something earned, not inherited. In one desert culture, when the royal granaries were looted during an invasion, it wasn't the generals who saved the people. It was a baker, just a man with wide arms and a sharper mind than anyone had realized. He rationed flour, taught preservation, organized watches against raiders. No formal power, no seal of office. But the people called him Flame Keeper because his ovens never went cold, even when the sky did. When asked years later how he learned to lead, he said, "I didn't, I just didn't stop." And that was often all it took. Sometimes new leaders didn't even look like leaders. In a northern tundra village buried in snow for most of the year, a young woman who tended goats ended up guiding her people through one of the worst winters in memory. She noticed when the goats refused to drink. It meant something in the weather was wrong. She changed their grazing patterns, redirected herd movement, and ultimately helped her entire community avoid a deadly frostbite season by predicting a whiteout storm days before it arrived. No title, no inheritance, just observation turned into protection. After that year, her name was carved into the doorframe of the village hall, not as a queen, as a reminder, and yet not all shifts in power were so quiet. In some places, when old governments collapsed, there was a scramble. Nobles trying to cling to relevance, priests insisting their gods had not abandoned them. But the people had changed. Once you've rebuilt your home with your own hands, bled into your own field, fed your neighbors without waiting for permission, you begin to question who, exactly, deserves your loyalty. That was the silent revolution of many post-collapse societies. Not with swords, but with shrugged obedience. When the tax collectors returned, people ignored them. When old gods demanded gold, people offered bread instead. And in time, the systems changed to match the mood. Even law itself evolved. In coastal towns rebuilt after tidal disasters, many of the old legal codes were abandoned in favor of agreements drawn in sand. Literal pacts written with sticks beside the sea and read aloud in front of everyone. You didn't need a judge in a robe. You needed witnesses, accountability, shared memory. If someone broke the pact, they didn't face prison. They faced shame. The community withheld help, denied trade, turned silence into justice. It wasn't always fair, but it was swift, and it belonged to them. Sometimes entire religious frameworks shifted. Temples that once served as engines of control became shelters. Monks stopped serving kings and started serving kitchens, turning prayer halls into infirmaries, altars into sleeping spaces. In a forest monastery, after a lightning fire consumed 3 villages, the remaining monks opened their gates to every survivor, whether believer or not. They wrote no scripture that year. Instead, they recorded stories, eyewitness accounts, family names. They acted as census takers of the broken. Their abbot said, "God is listening, but right now so must we." When the kingdom returned to rebuild the temples, they found new gods painted on the walls, not ones born of lightning, but of compassion. In scattered ruins, there's evidence of councils formed from tradespeople, potters, shepherds, fletchers, each with a voice, each with a stake. They didn't call it democracy, they called it the big table. Everyone ate, everyone spoke, and if you wanted more bread, you brought more wood. Leadership was a transaction of trust, not inheritance. And in times of rebuilding, it worked. Because when everything else had broken, people trusted what they could see. And what they saw were hands dirty with work, not rings shining with authority. The lesson is clear across continents and centuries. When power failed, community replaced it. Not with flags and anthems, but with hands, songs, walls built low enough to climb, but strong enough to hold. People organized not because they were told to, but because survival demanded it. And in doing so, they invented something extraordinary. A society where leadership was a verb, not a title. Something you did, not something you were born into. This is the quiet brilliance of post-collapse ancient communities, that they didn't just mourn the fall of their kings, they filled the silence with cooperation, memory, and grit. And in many cases, what came after the fall was more human, more connected, more alive than what stood before. When the earth cracked and temples crumbled, when idols lay shattered under the weight of fallen beams and the sky offered no reply to prayers screamed into the storm, that was when ancient faith was most tested. Because while kings could flee and walls could be rebuilt, it was far more difficult to mend what had been broken between humanity and its gods. And yet somehow, the spiritual thread endured, not always in the form it once held, not always with statues and chants and incense smoke rising from holy rooftops. No, after disaster, belief often took on quieter, smaller forms. It left the palaces and climbed into the hills. It walked barefoot, whispered instead of preached, and lit fires not for spectacle but for warmth. The divine became personal, and in that intimacy, it was reborn. Before the collapse, in nearly every corner of the ancient world, religion was a public affair. Grand, formal, orchestrated like a performance meant to impress the heavens. You went to the temple. You offered what you had. You stood behind someone who wore more gold than cloth and watched as priests negotiated with the divine on your behalf. But when the temples burned, when the gods seemed as absent as the rulers who once built monuments in their names, something shifted. Faith didn't vanish. It scattered. It flowed into alleys, into kitchens, into the hands of women grinding herbs and men tending graves. It became informal, desperate, human. You no longer prayed to preserve an empire. You prayed to survive the weak. And that changed everything. In one mountain enclave where war had toppled every shrine, a mother began drawing symbols into the dirt outside her tent, not the approved glyphs of the old priesthood, but shapes she claimed had come to her in dreams, spirals, eyes, suns with too many rays. At first, people mocked her, but when her daughter recovered from a sickness others hadn't survived, neighbors began to draw the same signs, not because they believed the gods had returned, but because they hoped they had. That's how new belief is born. Not from certainty, but from the refusal to let meaning die. Elsewhere, in the charred remains of a coastal temple, a fisherman began leaving fish not at the altar, but at the edge of the sea. Every day. Even when he had nothing for his own family. He would whisper to the waves, asking them to return to balance. He didn't know if it worked. But over time, others joined him. Farmers left dried herbs. Weavers left scraps of dyed thread. They no longer needed an intermediary. The sea was the shrine now. The ritual became a communal language. an agreement. We have not given up. That kind of collective hope is a force more ancient than the gods themselves. In some regions, the old gods were blamed for the suffering. Statues were torn down not by invaders but by the faithful themselves, furious, disillusioned, betrayed. But even in rage, there was belief. You don't destroy something you never cared for. You destroy what failed you, what disappointed your trust. And when the statues were gone, many found themselves carving new ones, smaller, made of clay, or wood, or even river stones. Not grand, not permanent, but meaningful, gods you could place by your bed, gods who didn't require temples, just presence. This wasn't the end of religion. It was its evolution, from spectacle to solace. In the hills where drought drove villages into dust, spiritual leaders began preaching less about appeasing angry deities and more about collective rituals of remembrance. A young mystic, barely more than a child, began gathering people around a single tree that had somehow survived the worst of the dryness. She told them the tree listened, that it remembered water. People brought cups, poured what little they could spare into the roots. They sang, not hymns of power or conquest, but songs of gratitude and grief. Eventually, they started planting again, not because the mystic promised the rain, but because she had shown them that someone still believed they could begin again. In other corners of the world, people turned inward, not in isolation, but in reflection. Meditation, not as doctrine but as practice, began to spread among those who had nothing left to hold. In cities reduced to rubble, individuals sat in the remains of their homes, breathing, focusing, reaching for clarity in silence. They carved mantras into wood, inked them into cloth, repeated them under their breath as they carried water or buried their dead. This was not religion as law. It was belief as endurance. A faith that said, I may never understand why this happened, but I will choose to remain present through it. Perhaps the most striking example comes from a devastated forest region where a fire wiped out generations of villages in a single dry season. No homes were spared, no temples survived, and yet the people, left with nothing, returned after the smoke cleared and began to build stone circles. Not for worship, but for memory. Each stone marked a name, a season, a feeling. They would gather inside these rings and speak aloud what they had lost, and then quietly what they still had. The circles grew, not upward like towers, but outward like arms. A space not to beg for mercy, but to acknowledge grief together. It was said that even years later, travelers would weep in those circles without knowing why, as if the stones had soaked up the sorrow and sang it back like a lullaby. Even the nature of the divine changed. Where once gods were distant, proud, and punishing, new spirits began to emerge, gentler, closer, more like ancestors than rulers. A stream became a grandmother, a mountain became a tired father, a fallen tree became a warrior who had laid down his sword to sleep. These weren't deities in the traditional sense. They were metaphors for healing, for continuity, for resilience. In this way, the divine didn't vanish after disaster. It softened, became accessible, forgiving, familiar. And sometimes, when faith was gone entirely, what took its place was something just as powerful: ritual without belief. People who no longer believed in the gods still lit candles, still washed their hands before planting, still told the stories to their children, not out of fear, but because the rhythm of ritual gave structure to days that otherwise felt like drifting wood. They didn't believe the fire would bring rain, but they lit it anyway, because doing so reminded them of when they were children and the world had rules. That comfort, that repetition, that flicker of continuity, it mattered. This was how spirituality survived collapse. Not through grand proclamations or the survival of holy sites, but through adaptation, through the willingness to question, to rage, to mourn, and then, somehow, to create again. The divine wasn't in the heavens anymore. It was in the act of rebuilding a wall, in feeding your neighbor, in whispering a name into the dirt before planting a seed, in a world that had burned, Belief became the ember that never fully went out. And if you look closely, many of those ancient transitions are still with us. In the way we light candles for the dead, in the way we pause at thresholds, in the way we look at the sky, even now when we feel small. These aren't habits, they're echoes, reminders that once, long ago, people stood in ruins and chose to believe that meaning could survive the fire. In the shadow of ruin, it was the sound of children that announced whether a civilization would live again. Not kings returned, not temples restored, not walls repaired, but the laughter, the arguments, the stomping of small, dirty feet in the dust of what once was sacred. Because when disaster came, as it always did, through flame or flood, disease or war, the children were the first to be quieted and the last to be forgotten in the records. But make no mistake, they were never absent. They watched everything. They remembered more than anyone realized. And when the grown world crumbled, it was often in the hands of children that the seeds of recovery were planted. Imagine a ruined village, its walls split like cracked pottery, its market long abandoned to weeds and silence. Somewhere among the rubble, a boy with a stick is drawing patterns in the dirt. They don't mean anything yet. To him, they're just spirals, lines, shapes. But if you asked his grandmother, she'd tell you that pattern was once carved into the gate of the town's grain house. The boy never saw it with his eyes. He only heard her stories, but there it is, etched again by a child who never saw the city whole. This is how memory sneaks past catastrophe. Not with scrolls, with games, with fingers in the dust. In times of plenty, children were sometimes protected, wrapped in love and leisure. But in the wake of collapse, that softness became a luxury. Childhood changed shape. There were still toys, bones carved into animals, spinning tops made from scrap wood, little boats folded from worn parchment. But the line between play and survival grew thin. One moment you were pretending to fish with your cousins. The next, you were actually learning how to do it for real, because the adults were too tired or too busy digging graves. Girls who once braided each other's hair before feasts now wove rope to bind fractured walls. Boys who once raced for fun now ran messages between watch points. No one said, "You're old enough now." There was no coming-of-age ceremony. The age came, uninvited, and didn't ask for permission. And yet, in the cruel gray shadow of disasters, children often brought back the color. They played where they could, with what they could. A broken pot became a drum. A ruined shrine became a climbing hill. Laughter, sudden, sharp, ridiculous, echoed through ruins like defiance. Adults might be too weary to dance, but children did. Sometimes alone, sometimes watched from doorways by exhausted parents who smiled for the first time in weeks. In one frost-struck town, the snow lingered for months beyond what anyone could remember. Crops failed, wood ran low, but one child, a boy of maybe 9, began carving faces into the snowbanks with a bent spoon. Each day, a new face. Some smiling, some frowning, some sticking out their tongues. People began to visit the sculptures. They laughed. They added scarves. They talked again. And when the snow melted, they carved the same faces into their doors. That boy never gave a speech, never claimed to save anyone. But he changed something, shifted the weight of grief by a fraction. And in a time when hope was fragile, that was everything. Some children were trained, deliberately, to carry what the elders feared they might forget. In a desert people's tradition, during times of prolonged drought, certain children would be chosen as water singers. They were taught not how to find water, but how to remember where it had once been. Their songs described the shape of land, the feel of the wind, the smell of certain flowers after rainfall. These weren't lullabies. They were maps in verse. And when the elders could no longer walk the dunes, it was these children who led caravans to old wells and hidden springs. They didn't carry weapons. They carried direction. Elsewhere, in mountain valleys where earthquakes had shattered every standing structure, children took on the roles of scouts and listeners. Their light footsteps made them ideal for creeping across unstable terrain, listening for cracks, testing new paths. Adults would whisper to them, "Tell us what the mountain says." It wasn't mystical. It was practical. Their eyes were sharper, their movements faster, their fear still tempered by curiosity. They became bridges between destruction and discovery. And in the telling of these stories later, they were called skyrunners. Not because they flew, but because they moved like wind between the stones of yesterday and the paths of tomorrow. There were, of course, tragedies. Some children were lost in fire, lost to hunger, lost in the confusion of migrations or the silence of sickness. And those losses were etched deeply into the bones of every surviving community. In certain cultures, when a child died after disaster, their name was not spoken for a season, not from shame, from reverence. Instead, their memory was honored through repetition of something they loved. If they loved flowers, seeds were planted in their name. If they told jokes, others repeated them. The child lived on not in mourning, but in echo. And those echoes taught the living how to carry grief without letting it turn to stone. But for the children who endured, who made it through, survival wasn't the only burden they carried. They became witnesses. When the elders were gone, when the records were burned, it was the children who told what happened, how the river rose, how the plague spread, how the invaders arrived, and more importantly, how the people rebuilt. Their stories weren't always accurate. They were filtered through fear, misunderstanding, fantasy, but they contained truth, emotional truth, and that was often more important than precision. In one coastal culture, a generation after a tsunami erased their village, a new settlement had risen inland. It was stronger, elevated, more cautious, but every spring, the children were taken to the old shore, not to play, to remember. Their elders would describe the old town, point to where the market had stood, where the temple once shimmered. Then the children would be asked to draw it in the sand, as best they could, not as architects, as storytellers. What they made was never exact, but each line held history, and with each passing year the story lived, not just of the wave that came, but of the hands that rebuilt in its wake. Because that's what children were, in the wake of ancient catastrophe. Not burdens, not just dependents, but vessels, of culture, of hope, of future. They didn't just survive the ruins. They played in them, sang through them, asked questions of them, and in doing so they taught everyone else that life, even broken, even uncertain, was still life, still worth living, still capable of joy. And when they grew up, those children who once carved faces into snow, who sang of wells, who walked barefoot over fractured temples, they became the new elders. And their stories weren't just about gods or kings. They were about being small in the face of disaster and choosing to grow anyway. That's what made their wisdom enduring. That's what made their leadership different. And that's why, centuries later, we still feel their footsteps echo in the very dirt of history. When the walls fell and the sky turned quiet, when the last funeral song had been sung and tools had cooled in the dirt, that's when something unexpected began to stir in the ancient world. Not rebuilding in the practical sense, not architecture, not agriculture, but art, creation for its own sake. Not because the body needed it, but because the spirit demanded it. Because after ruin, once the basic needs were met, there was always someone who took a shard of broken pottery and began to etch a story into it. Someone who picked up a lump of discarded clay and shaped it, not into a bowl, but into a face. Not functional, expressive, not essential to survival, essential to being human. In times of collapse, art didn't disappear. It changed. It left the grandeur of palaces and temples and found its way into kitchens, caves, and the backs of scavenged wood panels. The art that rose after disaster was rarely decorative. It was raw, urgent, and strange. Faces with wide eyes, animals that looked half real, half dream, symbols scrawled not to impress but to process. This wasn't art for ceremony. It was art for grief, art for confusion, art made by hands that had dug through rubble and still found the courage to shape something beautiful. In a burned-out lowland village where every building had been reduced to cinders, someone, we still don't know who, began painting the inside of a collapsed oven. Not with brushes, but with soot and a damp reed. Images of people holding hands, of stars, of animals leaping over fire. When others discovered the oven, they didn't erase it. They added to it. Soon, it became a gathering space. The oven became a gallery. Survivors would come to add a line, a symbol, a gesture, not for the gods, not for politics, but for themselves. And in time, this soot-blackened space became something sacred, not because it was ordained, but because it had witnessed so many honest marks of human memory. Elsewhere, in the far northern regions where glaciers moved like sleeping giants and the cold devoured everything except willpower, people wrapped their bodies in furs, but they also stitched into those furs delicate patterns. Embroideries, tiny colored threads that to the untrained eye seemed pointless. But if you followed the threads, you would find a story, a journey across ice, a lost sister, a storm that nearly swallowed a hunting party. These coats were not just warmth. They were narrative. They kept memory alive and wrapped it around the body like armor. Music, too, somehow, always survived. Even in the quietest ruins, someone would find a way to make sound. A reed whistle carved from a branch, a drum fashioned from stretched hide and salvaged wood, a string pulled tight across a shell. One girl, born in the wake of a great flood, was said to sing lullabies to the fish. She claimed they remembered the old city under the water. Her songs weren't written down, but mothers copied them. And years later, when the city was rebuilt on higher ground, the songs remained, carried in the throats of children who had never known the flood, but still sang about it as if it lived in their bones. In one hillside region, a woman who had once been a builder began shaping clay not into bricks, but into miniature replicas of the lost town, one house at a time. She remembered every rooftop, every pathway, every fountain. Her hands recreated the geography of memory. People came to her to find their homes again in miniature. Children were told, "Here's where you were born," and pointed to a clay house no bigger than a walnut. The woman never called herself an artist. She said only, "My hands remember what my eyes have lost." Those clay homes outlasted her. Some are still being found today. Even broken things were turned into beauty. In war-torn provinces, blacksmiths melted twisted blades and forged them into pendants, charms, and crude sculptures. Not because they needed decoration, but because they needed to believe that something made to destroy could be reshaped into something gentle. In marketplaces built after conflict, vendors sold jewelry made from shattered armor, earrings from broken arrowheads, necklaces from shield fragments, every piece worn like a prayer. May we never need these things again. And still, there was painting, charcoal on walls, dyes on cloth, berry juice smeared across flat stones. In many post-disaster cultures, color itself became an act of rebellion. To wear blue was to say, "We still have joy." To paint your door with yellow meant, "We remember the sun." And red was life. Red was always sacred. In one region, after a plague that decimated 2/3 of the population, those who remained marked their doorposts with red thumbprints, not as protection, but as acknowledgement. "We are still here," those marks said. "We carry those who are not." Art became therapy, memory, warning, celebration, sometimes all at once. In some cases, artists didn't even know they were artists. They were bakers who shaped bread into flowers, fishermen who wove nets in spiral patterns that made no difference to the catch, stonecutters who carved faces into unused corners of bricks. This wasn't efficiency, it was expression. The stubborn, beautiful insistence that life was more than survival. That even in ruins we still make meaning. In a canyon community reduced to half its original size after a firestorm, children began collecting colored stones, bits of glass, mineral, pottery. They arranged them on the edge of cliffs in spirals, symbols, sometimes even simple images of birds or hands. There was no teacher, no goal, just the impulse to create. Travelers later reported that at sunset, the stones caught the light in ways that turned the entire cliff edge into a shimmer of moving colors. No one claimed the art. It wasn't signed. It wasn't for sale. It was just there, and it moved people to tears. And that's the essence of ancient post-disaster creativity. It wasn't always formal, and it certainly wasn't always celebrated, but it happened, again and again, because the instinct to express is older than architecture, older than governance, older than language itself. It is the birthright of every human heart. And after everything else had been taken, homes, cities, names, gods, people still had their hands, their breath, their vision, and they used it to paint, to sing, to weave, to remember. So next time you see a small act of beauty made in a place of ruin, a flower painted on a bombed wall, a violin played beside a refugee fire, a poem etched into the side of a broken bench, know that it belongs to a long, unbroken lineage. A tradition not of luxury but of resistance. A declaration that says, "We have lost much, but not everything." There comes a moment after everything has collapsed, when the fields won't yield, the rivers run dry or drown the land, when the city walls are more ruin than shelter, when someone turns to their family, or their neighbors, or just the wind, and says something that changes everything. We can't stay. And so begins the long walk, the oldest story of all, the migration. It has no hero, no map, no single destination, just people, stepping away from the bones of what once was, hoping that somewhere beyond the next horizon, there's still a place to begin again. In the ancient world, mass movement wasn't a footnote. It was a cycle, a pulse. Entire cultures were shaped by the paths their ancestors took after disaster drove them into exile. Droughts, floods, famines, invasions, each one a crack in the earth that sent waves of humanity spilling into new lands. And with every footstep, they carried more than bundles and tools. They carried memory. They carried songs. They carried knowledge baked into bread recipes, etched into calloused hands, worn into the shape of prayer. There's an old story told by a mountain tribe that once lived beside a lake that disappeared over 3 generations. They say that when the water left, it didn't just vanish, it walked away. So the people followed. Not because they understood the hydrology, but because the world they knew had shifted, and survival meant moving with it. They crossed valleys, climbed ridges, lost some of their own to cliffs and storms, but eventually, they found a new lake. Not as wide, not as deep, but still, it shimmered. And they built a new home beside it. They named it after the old one. The name didn't fit at first, but after a few seasons, it did. That's what migration is, not just geography, alchemy, turning loss into legacy. In one river basin civilization, when the Great Flood came and swallowed their capital, entire families took to boats and floated downstream until the waters calmed. Where they landed, they built villages on stilts, higher and wiser. But before they laid the first log, they carved a symbol into the mud, the mark of their lost city. They didn't want to forget. Forgetting, they believed, was more dangerous than any storm. And so every new village they founded bore a piece of the old one, a name, a carving, a pattern in the bricks. Even after 4 generations, when the descendants had never seen the flood, they still sang about it, not with fear, with reverence. And migration wasn't always an escape. Sometimes it was a choice, a strategy. When people saw collapse coming, failing soil, changing winds, animals disappearing, they made the decision to move early. And that foresight became myth. In the far eastern grasslands, a people known for their mobility told stories of the whispering ground, a voice in the soil that told them when to go. Whether literal or poetic, they listened. They were rarely caught unprepared. They moved lightly, packed efficiently, left no temples to be burned or walls to fall. Their history was carried in wagons and memory, not in stone. And because of that, it survived. Migration also reshaped belief. When people moved, they took gods with them, but the gods changed too. A deity of the mountain became a protector of valleys. A river spirit became a guardian of rain. Stories were adjusted, retold, adapted to new landscapes. And with every retelling, the people themselves changed. A people who once measured life by the tides now tracked seasons by tree bark. A desert tribe adopted the sea and learned to fish with woven baskets instead of spears. Adaptation wasn't a betrayal of heritage. It was the heritage. A living memory that flexed, bent, but never broke. The emotional weight of migration was staggering. People left behind graves, walls etched with names, doorways that echoed with footsteps that would never return. But they also left behind fear, famine, violence, plague. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least it moved. And movement, even when painful, felt more alive than stillness in ruin. Children were born mid-journey, wrapped in cloaks that had once been market tents. Elders walked until they couldn't, and were buried in new soil, and those first burials marked the founding of a new beginning. A home not chosen, but earned. There's a haunting custom found in an island culture that fled volcanic destruction. Before leaving, every family took a pinch of earth from their home. They carried it in cloth pouches, tied with fiber and ash. When they reached their new land, they sprinkled the earth beneath their cooking fires, their threshold stones. They believed this helped the old spirits find them, that even if the mountain couldn't be saved, its soul could still travel. Archaeologists have found traces of that soil hundreds of miles from the original island, dark specks of memory buried in foreign ground. But migration was not only physical, it was cultural. Languages traveled with the people, and in the mouths of children they evolved. Songs picked up new rhythms, dances changed tempo, recipes merged with the flavors of new lands. Hybrid cultures bloomed like wildflowers, messy, beautiful, unplanned. And though some mourned the purity of what was lost, others celebrated the unexpectedness of what was created. Cultures are not museums, they are gardens, and migration is the wind that spreads the seeds. Still, not every step of the journey was graceful. Not every migration was peaceful. There were clashes, misunderstandings, resistance. People already living in the lands being resettled often pushed back. Resources became tension points. Borders were drawn in fear. And yet, in the long view of history, these moments of friction often led to fusion. Languages blended. Trade routes expanded. Rituals were shared. A single festival might contain symbols from 3 continents, not because of empire, but because of movement. And perhaps most profoundly, migration reshaped identity. You were no longer just from the north, or child of the river. You became the ones who came after. Your name included the journey, and with that shift came a new kind of strength, not rooted in place, but in story. You were no longer defined by what you had lost. You were defined by how far you had come. And that perhaps is the most ancient strength of all. After the flames died and the smoke thinned into memory, after the disease moved on or the invaders retreated or the floodwaters dissolved back into earth, what remained was not silence, but the sound of many hands, working, gathering, lifting, rebuilding. And in that ancient moment, before leaders returned, before the scribes recorded anything, before the old systems crept back into place, people remembered something older than empire, older than law, older than even language. That to survive, truly survive, we must do it together. Alone, you might mourn. Alone, you might hoard. Alone, you might make it a little while longer. But only together could you rebuild the world. In the earliest days after disaster, survival wasn't heroic. It was cooperative. People cooked in shared fires. Tools passed hand to hand. Those who knew how to build taught those who didn't. Those who could still walk carried water for those who could no longer stand. Strength was not a competition. It was a current, flowing where it was needed most. In one flooded valley, survivors strung thick vines between the treetops to move across sunken land. No one asked whose idea it was. They just climbed. That's how it often worked. Solutions emerged not from authority, but from necessity. And the ones who noticed the solution first rarely wanted credit. They just wanted to live. And so they organized. Not with elections or military hierarchy, but with rhythm and recognition. You dig, I carry. You watch the children, I'll go find roots. You sing while we build, because the silence is heavier than the stone. These weren't assigned roles. They were instinctual. And they changed, day by day, depending on who was still breathing, who had slept, who had cried last night, who had strength this morning. There was no shame in resting, no pride in burning out. Everyone knew, if we don't take care of each other, we're already lost. In one small mountain settlement, after a fire had gutted the entire southern quarter, they began rebuilding not by house, but by circle. Each week, one structure would be chosen. Every hand helped, regardless of who it belonged to. Children passed stones, elders painted protective symbols on beams, younger men and women shaped walls from mud and straw. The home was finished, and a meal was shared. Then the next home, and the next. It took months. No one was left out. And when the final home was rebuilt, even the abandoned one of a man who'd fled years earlier, they all stood in the center of the village, lit lanterns, and sang a song no one could remember learning. That's what cooperation sounds like. Not planning, but harmony. Trade, too, was reborn in new ways. After disaster, coins often lost meaning. Gold couldn't heat a room. Silver couldn't feed a baby. But skills, goods, time, these became currency. Barter flourished not out of poverty, but out of purpose. In lowland flood zones, a man who could weave baskets traded daily with a woman who raised goats. He got milk, she got containers. No haggling, no exploitation, just understanding. In war-torn regions, refugees created silent agreements with locals. Help with the harvest, share the yield. Protect the well, share the water. Everything was based on contribution and trust. No one dared break that trust, not just because of honor, but because of need. When survival depends on your neighbor, you treat your neighbor differently. Cooperation wasn't always peaceful. Disputes happened. Boundaries were tested. In one drought-racked corridor, two villages nearly came to blows over a single spring. But instead of war, they agreed on rotation. 3 days on, 3 days off. A third group, nomads passing through, built a water clock using stone drips and shadow markers to track usage. Disputes ended. A monument was erected, not to a king or a god, but to an agreement, to the simple miracle that 3 desperate peoples chose sharing over conflict. It still stands today, worn by weather, but legible. A testament to the idea that compromise is older than conquest. Rituals also played a critical role in reinforcing community. In many post-collapse societies, seasonal gatherings were revived, not for celebration, but for reconnection. One society, after losing half its population to plague, instituted a ritual of name-telling. Once a year, every family would speak aloud the names of those they had lost, and then, immediately after, the names of those who had helped them survive. It was said that no one could finish without tears, and no one left without a sense of belonging. The ritual turned pain into unity. It reminded everyone, we are bound not only by blood, but by action. Some forms of cooperation were entirely new. In a tundra plain where villages once competed for hunting grounds, survivors of a massive freeze began exchanging scouts. One tracker from each village would live and train with another. Within 2 seasons, a new dialect had formed, a mix of the old tongues. Trade became fluid, borders relaxed, and years later when new threats came, wolves, drought, disease, the region responded not as rival tribes, but as a single people, all because of a simple exchange of knowledge. Even technology was reshaped by cooperation. In an island cluster devastated by storms, shipbuilders from 3 different traditions came together to build a vessel none of them could have designed alone. The hull was shallow and curved, able to ride storm surges. The mast was split for balance. The sails were stitched from fibers usually reserved for fishing nets. It looked strange. It looked like nothing else in the known world. But it worked. And from that moment on, communities who had never shared tools began sharing blueprints, materials, and methods. Progress was no longer patented, it was gifted. It must be said, not all cooperation was idealistic. Some was forced, some was uneven. There were those who gave more than they received, those who took advantage, those who waited until others had cleared the debris before stepping in. But in the vast record of post-collapse history, what rises again and again is this. The places that recovered fastest and most completely were those where cooperation became culture, not just a response, but a way of life, not just something to survive with, but something to live by. And maybe that's the deepest wisdom ancient people passed on to us, that while disaster is often inevitable, isolation never has to be, that rebuilding isn't a solo act, that walls don't mean anything if they're not built with shared hands. Because in the end, survival is not only about what you can do, it's about what we can do together. After all the walls have been rebuilt, after the fields have bloomed again and the names of the fallen have become part of lullabies, there's still something left burning in the center of every ancient story. Not fire, not ruin, but resilience. And if you listen carefully beneath the layers of history, beneath the centuries of silence and stone, you'll hear it. Not as an echo, but as a heartbeat. It says, "We were here. We lost so much. But we are still here. And so are you." Because this story, this long dust-covered tale of disaster and recovery, of empires falling and villages singing anyway, it doesn't end in the past. It lives on every time we face a storm and hold someone's hand. Every time we lose something and choose to plant again. Every time we light a candle not because it brings light, but because it brings meaning. We are not just descendants of survivors. We are survivors still, carrying the same instincts, the same questions, the same need for each other. Look around our world today. The climate changes, the ground shakes, the skies sometimes threaten, and the systems we thought were solid suddenly feel fragile. But ancient people would not be surprised. They would look at us and nod, because they've lived it. And they would say, "Don't wait for the sky to clear. Start rebuilding now. Share what you know. Ask for help when you need it. Teach your neighbor something useful. Sing a little, even when there's no reason. Make something with your hands, even when your heart is heavy." These things are not distractions from survival. They are survival. The truth is, we've inherited more than tools or ruins from the ancient world. We've inherited templates. Templates for hope, for action, for how to come together when it feels like everything's falling apart. And what a gift that is, to know we don't have to figure it out alone, that there are blueprints buried in old songs, in forgotten rituals, in quiet acts of care that repeat across generations. And when we feel lost, when the world trembles a little under our feet, we can close our eyes and ask, not just what should I do, but what did they do when they stood here too? Maybe that's what this whole journey has been about. Not just history for history's sake, but recognition of their pain in our pain, their healing in our healing, their voice still somehow in ours. So if you've come this far with me through ancient ash and rain, through hunger, fire, silence, and the songs that rose anyway, then I want to ask something of you. Something more than a click, more than a view. If this story moved you, helped you see something differently, or made you feel a little more connected to the long thread of humanity, then take a moment, right now, and become part of this community. Hit that subscribe button, not just for the algorithm, but because this channel is a place for storytellers, survivors, thinkers, and dreamers, and you belong here. In the comments, tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever felt like the world was shaking and you had to find your own way through. Tell me what part of this story stuck with you, or reminded you of something your grandparents said, or a moment in your life that felt like rebuilding from scratch. We learn through story. We connect through memory. And here, on this channel, we honor the past not with silence, but with shared voices. Because that's what the ancient ones left behind. Not ruins, not warnings, but a chance. A chance to carry the torch a little farther down the road. A chance to leave something for those who will stand where we stand now, long after we are gone. So here's to the fire that remains. Here's to you. We'll meet again in the next story.